Our real humanity is centered around the gifts of life and love. Who we are at our core is God. Hi everyone, Angelo here. I'm a creative and theologian, and it's the Feast of the Epiphany. So we are still in chapter 2 of Matthew, and we typically know this story as the visit of the Magi, or the visit of the three wise men, or the three kings. Different names for the same story. So what happens is that baby Jesus is just born, and then we have some people who come into Jerusalem. They say come into Jerusalem from the east. Now we actually don't know if it's men or women because the Greek never really specified, as well as we don't know specifically if it was three. But we have these people who come and then they ask him about this baby king that's born because they see the star rising in the sky, which was typically a sign that a new leader is born. So nobody know what they're talking about, and then even the actual king, King Herod, he and all so confused. He called together the chief priests and the scribes, the religious leaders. He brings them together and asks them, what are these people talking about? Because as far as I know, no baby born inside of here. I ain't had no child. So what they talking about? And then they give Herod back this prophecy that would have come out of the prophets and says, and you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, you are by no means least among the leaders of Judah, for out of you will come a leader who will shepherd my people Israel. So then Herod calls the wise people in, and he says, hey, what's going on here? All you go and find out everything there is to find out about this child, so that I too may go and pay the baby king homage, that I too may go and worship him. So they leave, and then they see star rising and going before them. And then they are led to the Holy Family, of course, baby Jesus there in the middle. And then they offer them the gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh that we know so well from this story. And then the way the story ends is by the end of the visit, they would have gotten a dream. And then through that dream, they followed it and they went back, not to Herod, but they went back to their countries by a different way. Now, I feel like this story portrays humanity so well. And I say that because what happens when a baby is born? Like, what happens when a baby is born into a family? Everybody's tend to gather around, not so? And it's the same thing that we're seeing in this story today. So for the most part, I want to focus on the Magi in this story. As much as baby Jesus is who they were focusing on, and as much as baby Jesus is also who we should focus on, we could learn how to focus on baby Jesus through the Magi. So we don't know who these wise people are. Not from scripture, at least. Like throughout the tradition, there would have been different legends that developed and offered us some names. So I think in the Western tradition, because of course within the church, within the Christian church, you have many different traditions from East and West. But in our Western Roman tradition, I guess you could say Latin tradition, the names we typically tend to use are Caspar, Melchior, and Balthazar. And they would have represented major centers of wisdom, places like India and Persia and Ethiopia. Now the Magi, it's not that they were specific to these people alone in the story, right? Magi was a typical term that you would use. And people looked upon Magi as people who had more than human knowledge, than like super, super wisdom. But even with all that knowledge and wisdom, the Magi still did the same things as every other human. When a baby is born, they got excited and they wanted to visit. All that wisdom, and this is what captures their imagination. Like I look at my two nieces, recently born in 2025, and the way my family gathers around them constantly whenever we get a chance. And it goes to show you could be whoever with whatever achievements and qualifications. But at the end of the day, those are just minor finishes on our humanity. Our real humanity is centered around the gifts of life and love. And Westernism and capitalism would have us believe that our lives are measured by our achievements. But I think our souls tell us a different story. And remember, God is at the core of our souls. And who we are at our core is God. But our humanity can't be measured by what the global north tends to determine as success. Our humanity is measured by the quality of our relationships and our reflection on all our experiences, especially coming from these relationships, and what they might mean to bring about a better society, or in other words, on earth as it is in heaven. And we can find God in everything, but the question is, how do we bring God out of everything? How do we call divinity from inside ourselves and make it real outside of ourselves? All the wisdom the Magi had, and they still knew the best thing they could do with their lives is to visit a baby. I look at so many interviews where people talk about their lives and their success and whatnot. And at least in the interviews I watch, almost invariably, the people will talk about their parents or maybe even their grandparents, but some close relative who would have influenced them to be who they are. Or in other words, to draw out the potential that God had planted inside of them. And not everybody has the gift of people like that to be able to guide them. I mean, the Magi had baby Jesus, right? And so do we. And we can all, all of us, we can all draw the potential of our young people out once we can stick together. Because, it takes a village, right? You know the movie Soul? Soul is a really good movie to help draw out, I think, children's and maybe early teens, even mid-teens. But younger people, I think Soul is a really good movie to help draw out their potential. At least one way of many. It's like the rising star that is like the star rising and descending into earth. That's kind of how Soul was in a way. But there are so many things we can do because there's so many of us. And God gave each of us potential to draw the potential out of others. We all have the same God in us at the end of the day. And it's the same God that is growing and coming out of us. And not just in humans, but in every aspect of life. And when we discover who God is in us in particular, while we look at the real situation around us, we realize how upside down things are. And we can help God turn things right side up. Like Matthew had important people serving this baby. And in serving the baby, in other words, serving baby Jesus, in other words, following after Christ, they were also subverting the empire. And we can see their subversion when they decided to follow their dreams and say they're not about to deal up with somebody who is bad vibes. Meaning Herod. Herod is the bad vibes. Herod had heavy vibes. Same way so many of our politicians are just like Herod. Same way Herod was the politician and the leader of the place. Same way too so many of our politicians and leaders. Heavy vibes like Herod. Self-interested, with little regard for the people, especially the poor. And so that means Christianity has something specific to do. To subvert power structures that do not prioritize the least of us first. To burn down anything that reinforces oppression and poverty. Like even our early Christian ancestors subverted that from the earliest times. Of course, Christ himself, right? So then naturally the disciples would do the same. But to be Christian was to take a hard stance against the unjust empire. To be Christian was to say God is bigger than the power of the empire. God's love for the poor and the vulnerable is bigger than any oppressive imperial system. Now, the word Epiphany was typically used for Roman emperors that they were making like a state visit, right? And they were considered gods. Yet, as Christians, we recognize the power of God could never be in oppressors. And instead, we found God in the vulnerable family, specifically and especially in the baby. So I'll say it again. To be Christian is to take a hard stance against the empire. To be Christian is to say God is bigger than the empire. God's love for the poor and the vulnerable is bigger than any imperial system. Even when the state and the empire try to overtake religion, like what Herod did here by bringing together the religious leaders, when we engage with our religion meaningfully, we realize how empty the empire's promises are. Our faith can only be faith in God, especially in baby Jesus. Now, I always wonder why Christ came when he did. And one part of me, I feel like this was probably objectively one of the worst moments in history. And at the same time, this was also probably the best time for God to be able to do God's work through Jesus. And now in the world, things seem like they could use a lot of Jesus, which is now us. We are Christ, especially through the sacraments. We take on Christ and we understand our divine identity more. And theosis is what our faith is ultimately about. I mean, we don't talk about it too much in the Western church, it's in the Western tradition. But the reality is our faith teaches us that humanity is meant to be in union with God. And we believe in our divinity because of God's divinity. Not just because God's mercy makes divine union possible, but also because we are all made in the image and likeness of God. We all share the inviolable dignity of God. And until we can end all violations of dignity, the church has a lot of work to do. So we have a lot of work to do, meaning the body of Christ, the church, who is us. We can't leave it for other people in the church to do. And the church can't leave it for other people to do. Like, this isn't the priest's church, this isn't the Pope's church. This is our church. And our church has to actively seek Christ. All of us have to actively seek Christ. Because when we seek Christ, like the Magi did, we take on who he is in all that divine fullness. Like, take it in, the Magi's encounter with Christ made them take on who he was as well. Like, their visiting Christ also made them become fugitives too. And we would have seen last week that the Holy Family ultimately they were fugitives, because we know what happens after the story is that they had to flee and go to Egypt. So when we meet Christ, we take on who he is. And that is the people who he identified with through his life and his ministry and his death and his resurrection. So that means that Christ identified with people like the poor and the oppressed and the marginalized and the vulnerable. So when we take on who Christ is, we realize the Epiphany isn't just a biblical event that we contemplate. We realize the Epiphany is also a source of renewal. Because the same way that the star rose to bring the Magi to Christ, the same way we have to be the rising stars to bring all of creation to Christ. Anyways, that's it from me this week. And as always, I appreciate you so much for watching. Thank you.